Hey everybody, this is Ryan McClanahan with HistoryThroughCards.com. I hope you're all doing very well today. This video, I want to talk to you about price guides, and specifically a article that I was reading from 1993, kind of about the evolution of price guides from the 1993 perspective of a non-collector in the media. And one of the things that I really like about reading articles from mainstream media sources, unlike, say, Beckett here, this one's from April of 1991. I have a near complete run of Beckett's from the 80s through the 90s, 2000s, and I'm only missing like maybe 2 years and a handful of others. However, what I really kind of like about reading articles of non-collectors is they're really unbiased, and you're gonna hear this in this article about his perspective on price guides. And generally, when you're reading an article from someone who isn't a hobbyist, if for lack of a better term, um, they're unbiased, and usually it's the editor who is telling the writer go out and research this and write an article about it. And they might not know really anything about the subject that they're covering until the end when they have compiled all their information into one article. And so you're not really getting uh, a perspective of somebody who is a collector, which I think is kind of refreshing in a lot of ways, because again, they're not biased, or you shouldn't be biased when you're writing an article. Either way, political or whatever. Unfortunately, that's really kind of not the case anymore, which is too bad. But for the most part, I thought this was really interesting, and I actually did a video on price guides prior, and I kind of wanted to research how Jefferson Burdick and others decided to come up with a price guide. The first price guide for the hobby was actually not in 1939, but it was in 1927 or so, with the English hobby, really kind of like a sports card hobby that we know of today, really didn't start in the United States, but in Great Britain in 1927, and it was with the London Tobacco Company. And so the progression of the hobby, I think, is really fascinating. In about 1935, in December, Jefferson Burdick ended up writing articles basing the foundations of the American hobby in Hobbies magazine. Now, the funny thing is that he knew in the 1930s, leading up to the 1939 American or the U.S. card catalog, which turned into the American card catalog, he knew that in order to have the hobby grow, you needed to have a value placed on your sports cards. Otherwise, like nobody would, collect cards. It was his fear or thought. So he devised a way to have like columns for cards. Now, the funny thing is that when you look at some of these price guides from 1939 or 1946 or 53 or 56 or 1960, there's no individual prices for players. That only really kind of occurs in about 1967 after his passing, and Woody Gelman or Gelman ended up taking the reins over from Jefferson Burdick, who had passed away in 1963. So you really kind of start to see individual cards or individual players have prices in 1967, and that's with the T206 Bill O'Hara and the Ray Dummett, and there's a few others as well. For the most part, up until like 1943. I'm not entirely sure how Jefferson Burdick he lists his cards. Uh, it's not based on rarity or perceived rarity. We're not entirely sure because his way of evaluating some of these cards is way off. It's not even close to being accurate, but it's not based on rarity. And in 1943, uh, Charles Bray he starts the first auction for sports cards, and he tabulates how much these cards are actually going for. You know, aside from what Jefferson Burdick is doing, and Burdick isn't listing these cards based on what they're selling for. He's not doing that. That only comes in 1943. So prior to that, it's just, I'll pay you this much for that particular card, despite its rarity or despite who the player is. So for the most part, I think these cards were being sold in bulk and not individually. That's my guess. And some people are saying like, well, I need XYZ player, and they're not really being sold individually. I don't think for the most part. I think they're actually being sold in bulk through the mail, and a lot of collectors at the time are saying like, well, the rates for postage are way too expensive. They're talking about this, and that's really, I think, how a lot of collectors were getting their cards. So another thing I started to notice too was that Bill Mastro had said that a lot of these collectors, particularly in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, they were very insulated. They were just collecting amongst themselves and not sharing either their knowledge or the cards with anyone from the outside. And these were our hobby pioneers that we know and love today, which I thought that was really interesting, but it's also accurate as well. Um, they bought and sold cards for the most part. I think they just kind of traded among themselves, and it wasn't until like Bill Mastro came along and said, "Hey, wait a minute, guys. There are a lot of other collectors out here that want what you have." So he had said that 90% of the cards are being traded and bought and sold by 10% of the collecting population. I thought that was just a very observant observation, right? So that was really interesting to hear him say that because I had a sneaking suspicion that that was accurate and that was true. Um, and it didn't really open up until the card collectors got together and started to form shows and conventions in the late 1960s and early 70s that we see a huge population boom, if you will, within the hobby. It started to grow and mainstream more. That's when we see this like in the 1970s and especially in the 1980s. So James Beckett comes out with his Sport Americana in 1978. I got a bunch here in the back. But he came out with that in 1978 and kind of mainstreamed sports guides and prices, and he did that through a mathematical formula. And you're going to see something really interesting in this article that I really didn't consider before. So let's get into this. This is from the Courier Post, March 3rd, 1993, Camden, New Jersey. Collectible hobby needs more common sense by Louis Kolb. Card collectors, like most shoppers, are bargain hunters. Everybody wants a better deal. In the ever expanding world of sports collectibles, everything seems negotiable. Phrases such as, "Is this price firm?" and "What can you do for me?" are an everyday part of the hobby vernacular. Price guides were developed primarily to assist in this negotiation. Dr. James Beckett has always espoused the idea that the prices are, quote, "only a guide," that the collector will determine what is ultimately fair. But one of the industry's biggest problems is that too many people have become too dependent. Objective analysis is becoming a lost art. Even those that don't refer to Beckett Monthly as the gospel are indirectly affected by its existence. Although they are supposedly unbiased, dispassionate sources of information gathered by publishers from a variety of national contributors, price guides become self-sustaining and a slave to their own information. The dealer who reports to Beckett that he is selling a 1992 Flair Ultra Frank Thomas for $6 has biased his pricing decisions primarily on last month's quote. Without any other input during the off-season, prices can be a reflection based exclusively on what the price guide has said, not on any exemplary information. Generally speaking, dealer costs will determine dealer prices, but these costs are also market driven by the guiding hand of Dr. James Beckett. The hobby needs more independent thinkers to buy and sell based on their own analysis of a card's worth rather than depending on the subjective viewpoints of a third party. Remember, it's only a guide. Single card sales are more of an issue than boxes and sets, which are more directly tied into dealers' costs. With single cards, price guide information is based on player popularity and the issue's relative scarcity. At least in theory, it's all about supply and demand. Remember, it's only a guide. There are numerous illustrations of individual card prices that are quite frankly ridiculous. Sometimes I think somebody must be making up these to save time. Moderately talented. Among older cards, one of my favorite examples is a 1957 Topps issue of a former Dodger left-hander Johnny Podres. Beckett Monthly lists the double print card at $55, which is over 400% of the middle series commons price at $13. Although Padres pitched for 16 years in the big leagues, he won only 148 games, an average of 9 wins a season. He never won 20, only more than 15 on one occasion. These fairly pedestrian numbers occurred despite the fact that Padres pitched for a Dodger team that won 44 more games than any other National League franchise during his tenure, 1953 to 1966. From 1953 to 1963, such commons as Johnny Antonelli, Bob Buell, and Harvey Haddix all won more games. Jerry who? For those searching for 1958 cards, the Jerry Kendall rookie is up to $6.50 this month. To call Kendall a common is to pay a major compliment to a lifetime .213 hitter. His average numbers for a 10-year career are not exactly Hall of Fame: 4 home runs, 19 RBI, and 43 hits. His rookie card, number 221, is not an error and not from a difficult series. He never played for a popular team like the Yankees or Dodgers, yet not only is his card listed individually, but it actually went up in price. Remember, it's only a guide. Why is a Steve Hargan rookie, 1966, listed and rising? Why would dealers report activity on the 1972 Richie Zisk? Who the heck is Tom Chaney up in the 1957 set? Remember, it's only a guide. New card prices are often exorbitant, but the issue of speculation is entirely different. Every young player theoretically will always be a .213 lifetime hitter. What is this hobby needs now is a little more common sense. So remember, like this is 1993, right before the 1994 players' strike in baseball, and it's also during a time when speculation was rampant. It is now, in fact, too. It has been for quite some time, but the Baseball Beckett, I think, was the leading publication of the time, and it's really interesting that what Beckett did was that they sent out a form for the dealers to sign and go through how many cars that they sold and report back to Beckett each month, and in turn, the dealers would enter a raffle to win prizes. So, were the dealers correct on this stuff? Maybe. You know, there's a lot more sales outside of dealers, I think, at this point, that kind of escape the price guides. So, you know, at the time in the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s, I think the majority of people were using Beckett, and pricing cards today is a lot more difficult, I think. They go by comps, and I wasn't sure what a comp was. I initially thought a complimentary hotel room, right? So me being an old school guy here, I had to contact Dan the card man and ask him what a comp was. So he was very good about it too. But and he's got a great channel himself. I really enjoy Dan the card man's channel. Anyway, uh, so it's a lot more difficult now to try to find out what these cards actually go for, what they should be going for through comps. I think it's very difficult because you're only looking at a certain amount of cards. And now, if you go for grading cards or raw cards, now you have two different values for the same card. And me being me, I tend to go for the raw cards, but I'm not going for the grading card specifically because the grade on the card or what the grading company is doesn't really matter to me if it's PSA or SGC or what. You know, it's the card itself that I really care about, and if I need to add the card to my collection, and as I always say that like some cards you need to buy right then and there, depending on the rarity of the card and who is on the card. Some things I thought were really interesting too in this other article that I'm going to read, and it has a lot to do with the variances of the guides themselves. And I think you're going to find this really fascinating. This is from the Democrat and Chronicle, November 2nd, 1993, Rochester, New York. Collector's Sports Look Deserves a Look by Frank Belofsky. New magazine has legitimate writing. The new kid on the sports card block, Collector's Sports Look, debuts with impressive credentials. Start with the editor, Tucker Freeman Smith, who did a great job bleeding Tough Stuff from its tabloid newspaper format days ago. Its current easy to handle magazine style. That publication has become easy to read and filled with prices that you normally can't find anywhere else. Autographed material and Perez steel, boxing, golf, auto, racing, classic, and starting lineup collectible prices. Its writers are several levels above many similar publications on the market. That's especially true of Sports Collectors Digest, which had been a staple of the sports memorabilia hobby and is usually referred to as SCD. But in our opinion, any hobby magazine that featured writers like dealers Alan Rosen, Joshua Evans, and Jim Hawkins to fill its supposedly objective news hole should change its name to SCI or Super Conflict of Interest. But Tough Stuff still had the problem of using some dealers and hobby insiders as writers, again a conflict. Enter Beckett's monthly publications, founded by Dr. James Beckett, who raised the annual price guide to a position of becoming the Bible that collectors carried with them to shows and card shops. Beckett promised to put out a quality magazine with professional writers instead of dealer shills. He also said his price guides, that's really what the magazines were, to try to reflect an accurate value of cards rather than listening to what dealers reported the value to be. And for the most part, he succeeded. The problem here was price. At $2.95 each, the Beckett monthlies for the four major sports require an output of $11.80 each month. So Collector's Sportsbook seemed to combine the quality of Beckett with the value of Tough Stuff. It featured objective writers, Gannett's Bill Varner, the Associated Press's Barry Wilner, New York City reporter Peter Finney, etc., and columnists who are more collectors than dealers, Barry Halper, etc. Oh, God. Okay, we won't get into that one. It also has a reasonable $3.95 for a magazine that includes price guides of all four sports. It earned a small minus in that it listed some non-sports prices, not surprising since its publisher, Gareb Shamus Enterprises, also publishes some non-sports price guides, but it earned a big plus by featuring the 10 hottest sets and 20 hottest cards in each of the four major sports. Objective? Hardly possible, but what the lists beautifully illustrated in the color like the rest of the book did was to create discussion, and discussion and talk is good for the hobby. How does the price guide stack up? Not very well, if you believe, as this writer does, that all price guides give hobbyists an inflated concept of the worth of their material and eventually cause them to lose interest. We decided to take the 10 hottest baseball sets and 20 hottest baseball cards and compare the November Collectors Sportslook prices with those listed in Tough Stuff and Beckett with the same cover dates. For the 18 cards listed in the three publications, the total value was Tough Stuff $1,031.50, Beckett $1,156, and Collector's Sportslook $1,243. For the 10 sets, factory set prices used for the two Donruss sets, the total value was $2,795 Beckett, $2,860 Tough Stuff, and $3,135 Collector's Sportslook. For the record, the new publication listed the 1987 Fleer Barry Bonds as the hottest baseball card and the 1992 Bowman as the hottest set. Top cards and sets in the other three sports, football, 1992 Bowman foil Emmitt Smith, 1992 Bowman. Basketball, 1986-87 Fleer Michael Jordan, 1992-93 Hoops 2. Hockey, 1985-86 O.P.G. Mario Lemieux, 1992-1993 Bowman. Any arguments or prediction Collector's Sportslook will earn a spot of the top of the price guide list, and if it eliminates the non-sports material and makes the price guide more realistic, it may just be number one in the future. So in the 1970s, there's really not a whole lot of accurate pricing data or reliable data to go on. You have Burt Randolph Sugar's book that came out in 1977, and I think it was updated up through like 1983, 84. But I'm not entirely sure how he came up with some of the pricing data that he included in his book. I actually have it. I rely on it sometimes, but again, it's not very reliable because I don't know where he's getting his sources from. And then you have the Sport Americana, which was Dr. James Beckett and Denny X. That was their book. They came out in 1978, and that's obviously more reliable because Beckett is using a mathematical formula to come up with his pricing data, and so up until like November of 1984. Most people were using the Sport Americana, but that was actually a pretty expensive book. I believe that was going for about $9.95. So if you were a kid collecting in the 1980s, that book was like a yearly publication, and again, it may have been accurate up to a certain point, but if you're only buying it, say in like February or April, what's going on for the rest of the year, right? So uh, in November of 1984, Beckett comes out with his monthly magazine. I have a copy of that, not original, but they did reprints back in 2001, so I have a reprint of that, and that's actually a really interesting read all by itself. and at some point I'll probably do a video on. I'll do more videos on Beckett for sure. There was also a price guide from 1981 in the spring of 81 called Baseball Cards Magazine, and this was Bob Lemke's uh, his issue. He was a publisher of this magazine. So there is a price guide in here, and it's a little bit high, I think. I'm not entirely sure how he's getting away with some of his pricing here too. But he also has two columns as well as the ones you see in Beckett here. For the most part, what I read from one dealer was that the low value of the price guide in Beckett was what the dealer was willing to pay uh, the uh, the collector. And so when I was a kid, some strange reason, I ended up pulling a lot of Frank Thomas cards then, and Frank Thomas was going for about $5 a piece. I had five of these cards, and I was like, great, I have enough money that I can keep one, set it aside, and sell the rest. And I went to my local card shop, and I was like, I'd like $15. He's like, I can't buy these cards off you because you're underage, you're a teenager, and if uh, I did any business with you, and somebody came in and saw this, that they might think that I'm taking advantage of a teenager and someone who is underage. So he's like, I can sell you cards, but I can't buy them off of you. And at the time, I was like, what? Like that doesn't make any sense. But actually, it does because again, as a dealer, you could take advantage of a kid who might not know and really doesn't know economics. And this is really my first lesson in economics at the time. Just because a card lists at $1 doesn't mean you're going to get $1 for the card or whatever the price guide lists it as. The dealer has all sorts of reasons why he can't pay you that, say, that $15 or that dollar for that particular card because he has overhead expenses. And if it's a card shop, as I was used to, as the only way really to get cards up until I was a teenager. I started out really collecting cards at shops, but then they kind of disappeared because of the internet and eBay. But the other way I was getting cards too was through either Mike Wheat cards or Wayne Varner shoebox cards, and both of those shops were through the mail, so you could get a catalog through those guys, and they'd send you cards that way. Getting back to the shop owner here, so it's really that simple. Is that the first row is where the dealer is going to buy your cards, and the second row is where he's going to sell your cards potentially, and uh, that to me, it made more sense as I got older, but at the time it didn't make a whole lot of sense. And a lot of things obviously have changed in the hobby when it comes to buying and selling cards from teenagers. In my day, I hate to say it like that, but in my day, that was a huge no-no. You could sell them to teenagers, but you couldn't buy them. So I was at a card show a couple of years ago, and I came across a deal between a dealer and a teenager. He was actually, I believe, 13 years old. He had a bunch of graded cards, and the dealer bought these cards for $800. And I stood back. I'm like, that would never have flown when I was 13 years old, and I couldn't really kind of believe that that actually happened. And you actually need to have a perspective of the value of a dollar as well. And that's the one thing that kept me from selling my cards after college. I started to fear that I was losing a perspective of the value of a dollar because it's really easy to have stacks of cash with these cards and you're doing major deals at shows. And I've seen a lot of these actually at shows, and just you eventually kind of like stop thinking about the card or the player or whatever it is, that you're selling, and it's really more about the cash. And unfortunately, today, when I tell people that I collect cards, the first thing that they ask me is, "What's your most valuable card?" And I used to tell them, but I no longer tell people what my most valuable cards are. First off, I don't want to get robbed. Second off, is that really what the hobby is now all about? Is the value of your cards and nothing else? If that's the case, you might as well be selling socks or T-shirts or whatever. So one thing I really don't like about Beckett Monthly is the up arrows and the down arrows at the time. It really kind of turned the Beckett Price Guide into the Wall Street Journal of the hobby. So usually the first thing out of any writer's mouth in the regular press was, these cards are valuable. You can get XYZ for this kind of card you have, and go to your dealer right away and sell them. Well, it's not that easy, obviously. And then Beckett kind of like muddied the waters, I think, with having their their XRC uh, and their up and down arrows, and kids started to follow Beckett as if it was the Wall Street Journal and hinged every word on what Beckett was telling them. And again, as that writer had said, that some of these prices may be inflated, and this is really kind of like where the speculators come in, because I mean, you get speculators in the early days of the hobby with Preston Oram, and he's from the 1950s. However, speculators really kind of make their presence known in about 1981 when the Topps monopoly broke up, and then Flair and Don Russ come in, and you get story after story of people who are buying all these Flair and Don Russ products, and they're really speculating on how much these cards are worth, especially with Flair, because and Don Russ too, because a lot of these cards that they're noticing are not printed very well, and there's a lot of mistakes being made, a lot of errors, and so like the prices are going through the roof in those initial months that both of these cards were being issued. There's no real rhyme or reason why some of these cards are priced the way they are, especially if you go back to the late 1970s and 1980s, and a lot of the cards that are going for a lot. So, like in 1992, Steve Avery, for example, his a 1992 Bowman, I believe, was going for about $20. Well, it's definitely not going for $20 now in 2024. And that set alone was going for, I believe, $300. But if you look at the prices then, that are in these Becketts from like say 1991 or 1989 or 1903, they really, I believe, are inflated. There's no rhyme or reason why some of these cards are priced the way they are. 25, 30 years later, you don't have the same generation that are collecting those cards today. So like Gen Z or Gen Y or whatever, I, they're not collecting cards that are like 25, 30 years old. They're collecting cards now, and what you're going to see going forward in another 20, 30 years, that maybe Gen Z are collecting those cards. Like I collect cards from like the 1980s because they are a memory, but that's really the only reason why. Um, Speculators are not collecting cards because of their memories. They're collecting them because of the value associated. The value of the cards back in say 1991, it's a lot different now because of inflation, and what your dollar is purchasing is a lot less. In 1991, the 1984 Don Russ set is going for $350 or $235, depending on whether or not the dealer is selling it, right, or the collector. But 235 to 350, and Ryan Sandberg MVP $17. Darryl Strawberry rookie is between $35 and $48 and going up. And you see a lot of these up prices here. Now, what was that that price actually in 2023 or 2024 dollars. So I can tell you right off the bat through this inflation calculator that I have. I love this thing. Anyway, that $48 in 1984 is the 2024 equivalent of $140.77. It's 193.3% of the cumulative inflation rate. What people were actually making in salary in 1984 as well. So that always comes into play as well. It's just not what you're seeing, where, you know, Wade Boggs in 1984, Don Ross, $10. Well, that may seem cheap, but at the time it's not. And same with Don Mattingly rookie, which was $85 and going down. So in 1984, $85 is the 2024 equivalent of $249.27. I don't think any kids would buy that card. They couldn't buy that card if what happened to me was accurate throughout the hobby. But again, and that would probably depend too on the dealer as well, and if the dealer was honest, and you know, not all dealers are created equal, right? So same with collectors. These prices here in these price guides, you really do have to take into consideration inflation and then what people were making in 1984 or 1983 or 1975, and it all kind of plays into what these cards were actually selling for, and not just what you're seeing in the price guide, what's actually being sold at card shops as well. Are they reporting accurately? You would like to think so. Today it's really muddled, I think, because you have two standards of price for one card, one being graded and then the other being raw. And a lot of, I guess, card collectors, they prefer graded cards over raw for the most part, I think. I could be wrong about that because I'm kind of old school. For me personally, I'd rather do raw cards. I've been in the hobby for, well, Jesus, a long, long time, longer than a lot of people have been alive that are on YouTube. So I'm kind of an older collector here at this point. I first started out in the modern hobby in 1982. That gives you kind of a figure of how old I am. With age comes wisdom, but that's not always the case because you're always learning and you always should learn, no matter how old you are and no matter if you're in school or out of school, always be learning new things. So, you know, for me personally, the hobby is something that has been very good to me and not just collecting cards. I've gotten a fantastic education and a fantastic economic education through sports cards. So, going to sports card shows is a great way to hone in on your negotiating skills and ask for what you want. If you don't walk away with anything, that's fine too. At least you tried. The only way you fail is by not trying. You won't always come out on top on what you want, but if you negotiate for it and you do it in good faith, you should be okay. And so that's why I always like going to card shows. And then again, card shows are another great way to look at cards and know what you're purchasing. Ask questions as well. I don't think there's any stupid question that you can ask. There's a lot of stupid answers from people, but no stupid question. I had a lot of questions about a lot of the players, a lot of the cards. We have a lot of information at the tips of our fingers like no other generation, but is it accurate? It's always a tough call sometimes. As again, I've been in the hobby now, the vintage hobby for over 30 years, and the modern hobby, I started out in '82, so it's a long time, and I figured I might as well pay it forward, if you will, kind of like teach other people, or at least give other people the information that I was looking for when I was a kid and didn't have it. Fortunately for me, though, I did come across a group of older collectors, guys who collected in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, who did know what they were doing. and kind of showed me the ropes. But that was after, and making mistakes is human. We all make mistakes, and it's fine to make a mistake as long as you learn from it and don't make the same mistake twice. As they always say, measure twice and cut once. And same thing is true with the hobby as well. But again, going to card shows and going to dealers and asking them questions, and just have a list of all the questions that you might want to ask a dealer. Go around the room and just, they don't know, they don't know, but at least you'll be better off. And that's really kind of like all I can say about this. The one thing that really kind of bothers me today about price guides is we don't really have a standard price guide for everything. Um, and Bob Lemke has passed away, I think, in 2012, and he was actually really good at a lot of the research into vintage cards and cards in general and the prices, what people should pay for, which is all over the map now. Unfortunately, nothing is kind of like jumbled up. Here you go. Here's this. Here's that. And here's this. And here's where to look for this stuff. There really, I don't think, is one source, and so that kind of bothers me. And again, there's two different, I guess, platforms for raw and for graded cards, and I never understood that. And the one thing that I do remember back in like the early '90s to the mid '90s, in fact, even maybe the late '90s, was that when grading came out, when graded cards came out, they were viewed as very suspicious. Nobody knew how to sell these cards. They didn't know how to price them out. And so a lot of people, including myself, stayed away from graded cards because they thought that they were a fad. And a lot of people treated them that way because they're so used to raw cards, everything being raw. And we had basically one price guide that almost everybody used, either Tough Stuff. For the most part, I didn't see a whole lot of. I didn't see any baseball cards magazine. I just, we didn't have it here in Massachusetts that I'm aware of, um, and so Beckett was our go-to. And it was kind of funny. I think I've told you guys this in the past, but when me and my cousin were kids, we used to go to shops or flea markets or whatever. And the one thing that he really kind of like drilled into my head was to always keep a Beckett on hand. Now, so Beckett's weren't bought every month. They were just really kind of too expensive at $2.95. And I think they went up after that to, I think, maybe $3 or so. These things were really gold to us. We really did treat them like the Wall Street Journal of the hobby, and we used to roll one up. And I used to have it in my back pocket or my pocket, and then we'd look at a couple of cards, and then we'd walk away from the dealer and kind of huddle, and then look through the Beckett again and see if that was a great price for that card. But we didn't want the dealer to know about this, what we were doing. So we kept it very low key, very hush hush, if you will. And then we negotiated for cards. And for some reason, my cousin was a real pro at spotting great deals. He made great deals on virtually everything. I don't know how he did it, but he brought home some amazing stuff. He was just that kind of wheeler dealer kind of guy. He still is, in fact, in my opinion. And he was a go-to source for me personally. If I wanted more information on a lot of the cards or how he got cards, I never really understood how he did some of this stuff, but it was very impressive. I'm still impressed. So anyway, guys, that's my look into the price guides. I think that this is something that we really kind of need to look into again, because from my personal view, we don't have any standards anymore. They have kind of gone away. So price guides are really kind of like the beginning of negotiations. And as I recall, and I've noticed that when you go to a show, you can almost kind of throw the price guide out the window. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense on the show floor, and it's just up to you to negotiate what you're comfortable with paying. And if you don't like what the dealer has for a price on that card, walk away. So that could really sour your perception on the hobby, and think that everyone's trying to rip me off, and you'd walk away if you had that pit in the bottom of your stomach because you knew that you paid too much, or you didn't study the values of these cards, whatever they may be. That's happened to me a few times. It's happened to everybody. But I really kind of think that you should kind of study at these shows and see what they're asking. Some prices you will know what to pay for eventually, and what is a good deal and what is not, by how many cards you actually see at shows. And this is why shows are, like I say, interactive classrooms. But anyway, guys, so that's my take on this for now. I'm most likely going to read up and study more on Beckett and these price guides, and tell you guys about how I feel about them, and the evolution of price guides, because I think it's a very interesting thing, and something that isn't really talked about as much. So again, guys, thank you so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it as always. Let me know about what you think of price guides, if they're a good thing, if they're a bad thing. Should we have a universal price guide for all cards? A standard. We had standards before. We've kind of gotten away from our standards in the hobby, and the evolution of standards within the hobby is something that is equally as fascinating, and I should get into a discussion about that as well. So guys, again, thank you so much. As I always appreciate it. I always appreciate you guys stopping by and the conversations that we have. So again, I'll talk to you later, and have a good one. Bye.